Karen, thank you very much for the lovely introduction, and particularly to the shout out to my hometown, the Bronx, New York. So what I'm going to talk about today is TMI, too much information, disengagement, and memory. If we can't disengage from non-relevant information, we can make mistakes and we will end up with too much information in mind. And that's basically what I'm going to be talking about. So, for example, in the pre-COVID world, and maybe for some of you still, we lived in a world that was filled with non-relevant information. For example, negotiating our way through a gigantic store in order to find the pharmacy, or negotiating our way through Times Square in New York City in order to find a particular location, or trying hard to pay attention to one picture in a museum with a cluttered display of pictures and tchotchkes. In addition to these external sources of information, because the world is typically filled with distraction, there are also internal sources of information. For example, what you did before you got into the museum. You walked past a gift shop and you didn't really have time to stop and pick up a present, although you wanted to. And you also have in your head the fact that you only have so much time to look at these paintings because you need to meet a friend for dinner. So our heads are filled with all kinds of information from the external world and from the internal world. So based on these everyday observations and on very few limited empirical findings, Rose Zaks and I proposed early on inhibitory theory, proposing that inhibition, the ability to downregulate information, was a critical component of cognition, in part because excitatory processes are automatic and all the familiar stimuli in the world activate their representations in mind, and we need to dampen these representations so that we can focus on the set that's relevant for our current goals. We propose that excitatory processes are spared with age, and in contrast, that inhibitory processes are less effective in childhood, in old age, at off-peak times of day with alcohol intake, and likely now with now legal drugs. And we also proposed that there were individual differences in the ability to regulate inhibition. Although controversial when we first proposed these ideas, there is by now a great deal of evidence, both behavioral and brain-based, that there actually are inhibitory processes, that they are important for efficient cognition, and that there are age and individual differences in efficiency. So we propose that information operates at least 3 times during the flow of information coming in from the outside world or coming from our heads. The first is that we need to filter out irrelevant, unwanted information. Then we need to disengage from no longer relevant or never relevant information that did happen to get in. And finally, we need to suppress competitors so that we can enable a response to be selected in the face of competition. So to explore this theory, we took 2 routes. One route is the one that I'm going to talk about today. The route that I'm not talking about has got to do with performance at off-peak times of day. I'm going to focus on this main line of work that we did comparing younger and older adults. The younger adults in our studies were university students, and the older adults were university educated, and many of them were graduates of the university. Their ages range from 60 to 76, and across these studies, the sample sizes range from 18 to 36 or so. The participants are naive to memory studies, especially to implicit tasks, to avoid carryover effects from the past. Why did we pick naive participants? Because you'll see that carryover effects are profound, and we wish to avoid these to the degree possible. So, this is the outline of the talk. Dealing with distraction occurs at 3 points in the flow of information, as I said. The tasks that you're doing right now, which is the first thing I'm going to talk about. What happens to information when it's no longer relevant? for example, when you've left the supermarket, and what happens when we need to produce one response and there are other competing candidates. These issues are addressed in the first 3 phases of this talk with theory or a summary relating back to the theory at the end. So let me begin with concurrent distraction. So this is a study of Cynthia Mays. What she did was to rely on this classical task called remote associates. In remote associates, you see 3 words which really are unrelated to each other: arm, coat, coal, and peach, except by a missing 4th word. And if you generate that 4th word, you can group the 3 together. So pit is the answer to this problem. In the study, Cindy presented these items either alone, as in the first box, or with distractors, as in the next 2 boxes. The distractors came in 2 varieties. They could be misleading or they could be leading towards the solution. So leading would be underarm, peach seed, leading towards pit, and misleading would be arm, leg, peach, orange, having nothing to do particularly with pits. So people got 40 of these problems, and they had 30 seconds to generate a solution for each. And what you'll see next are the data. So first of all, with respect to the note, I forgot to say that everyone was warned not to pay attention to the distraction because it was going to hurt their performance. So the first thing that Cindy looked at was the performance on the control items when no distraction was present. Younger and older adults solved the same number of problems. When distraction was present, here's what young adults look like. No effect whatsoever. They behave as if the distraction was not there. They solve pretty much the same number of items, whether the distraction is misleading or leading. Older adults, on the other hand, solve fewer problems in blue when there's misleading distraction, and they solve more problems when there is leading distraction. So it's difficult for older adults to ignore distraction, and the distraction leaches into their performance. Now I'm going to show you another task that makes a very similar point. There are probably 100 studies that I could select, not just from my lab, that make this point, but here's a nice task that we used along the way. People read short stories with distraction interpolated between the continuous text. So the distraction could be X strings, for example, or they could be unrelated words. I'll do a little reading for you now. The car ride was getting bumpy now that George had left the main road to use the dirt road, and so on and so on. So this is the X string version. And this next slide shows you what the interpolated word condition looks like. I'll just read the first sentence in order not to humiliate myself along the way. Sharon Brown's car had fallen apart to the point of being a total write-off. She needed to get around town, so she applied yada, yada, yada. You can see that my reading is much less fluent with distraction present. And here's what the data look like for young adults on the left and older adults on the right, the X strings in red and the words in blue. So older adults in general are slower than young adults. Both young and older adults slow down when there are words present, but older adults slow down still more. In one of these studies, there was an additional condition where the words could be related to the target text, meaningfully related to the target text. In that condition, older adults slowed down still more relative to the unrelated condition, but young adults treated the related words just as they treated the unrelated words, no additional slowdown. So older adults are differentially slowed by the presence of distraction. Across both age groups, distraction matters, but it matters more for older adults. Behavioral evidence points to less control. Now I'm going to show you data from a neuroimaging study that was led by Karen Campbell and done with my colleague Cheryl Grady. In this experiment, we wanted to look at the neural underpinnings of the distraction effect. So we showed younger and older adults a series of rapidly presented pictures. The task was a very simple one. Each picture was superimposed by either a word, as in this example, or a non-word, but they were irrelevant to the task, which was simply to indicate whether the picture that you're looking at right now was exactly the same as the picture that you just saw. So this is a so-called one-back task. So we used partial least squares analysis to analyze the fMR data. Partial least squares is a multivariate technique that shows patterns of brain activity that are differentially activated across conditions. The activation here is tied to the frontoparietal network, attention network, and the brain score, the so-called brain score or activity, shows you the pattern with young adults showing higher activation of the frontoparietal network when unrelated words are imposed on the pictures than when non-words are imposed. You see that older adults show absolutely no activation of this network. They appear not to use these regions. The region was actually silent. And it's conceivable that this silence is critical for allowing irrelevant information to enter into consideration. So I've talked about control over co-occurring distraction. Poor performance can create errors and can slow processing, but it can also help performance, as we saw. Whatever the case is, older adults are more affected by the distraction, and as a result of this, older adults likely have more information in mind at any given moment than young adults. Too much information. So now I'm going to switch to talking about age differences in disengaging from distraction or disengaging from the past. So I'm going to talk about the impact of no longer relevant information. This is, you've now left the museum and you're about to meet your friend, or you've left the supermarket and you're about to drive on your way home or take the bus on the way home. If we can't disengage from the past, information from the past will be maintained at switch points. This will occur whenever switch points occur whenever tasks change, when topics change in a conversation, when our goals change or our plans change, whenever events change or scenes change. At all of these points, we are better off if we stop processing the information from the past because it may be completely irrelevant to what we're doing now. So there are negative effects from not being able to disengage from the past. I am going to focus on the positive effects. And the studies that I'll show you will show you behavior as carryover or transfer effects, and these effects can be negative or positive. And we can also see the carryover effect in brain activity, as you will shortly see. Positive effects of past information. In these series of studies, we are using implicit memory tasks to test for either information that was never relevant, for example, the distraction in those one-back tasks, or information that was relevant in the past but is no longer relevant. We use implicit memory measures because much of what we remember in the world is actually involuntary, triggered by cues in the environment, and we think that implicit retrieval is actually a model of this everyday memory operation. It's also a large part of what guides our behavior, implicit cognition, behavior outside of the lab, outside of the classroom, and outside of our working lives. So the first couple of studies look at performance, the impact of never relevant information on performance. The general procedures in these studies, and I'm going to show you two of them. In the study phase, people do an encoding task with verbal distraction. Then there's a filler task, a delay period that's typically 10 to 15 minutes long. The delay period is filled with nonverbal tasks. Finally, there's a test phase, implicit test for the knowledge of distraction seen in the very first phase. The first study uses fragment completion as an implicit test, And the second study uses general knowledge as an implicit test. Okay, so what I want to do now is give you a sense of what this one-back task looks like, a very quick sense of what the one-back task looks like in the context of the experiment. So you see each picture and its superimposed word or non-word for 1 second. Okay, filler task, and then you get a fragment completion test in this study led by Gillian Rowe. Some of the fragments, the ones in red here, can be completed by some of the superimposed words that occurred in the one-back task. And the question is, to what degree do you solve those fragments over and above how you would have done had you not seen those words in the context of the one-back task? Well, here's what young adults do. The past makes no difference to them. They show no greater priming from these distractors. Older adults, on the other hand, show substantial priming. They are using the non-relevant words in the one-back task, like liver in this example, to solve the fragment over and above their baseline. In the second experiment, we used a general knowledge test to measure the use of the distraction. Once again, the study phase of one of these studies was a one-back task on pictures, followed by a delay, and the test phase was general knowledge. These studies have been led by Tarek Amer. So here are a few examples of the general knowledge questions that we asked people. What's the fastest animal on Earth? Cheetah. What metal makes up 10% of yellow gold? Copper. What's the most abundant element in the sun? Hydrogen. So once again, we are interested in the degree to which people use this distraction that they saw in the first part of the study to answer these general knowledge questions over and above their baseline solution rates. And here are the data for young adults. Once again, they don't use that information at all. And here are the data for older adults. Once again, they do use that information. So the main takeaway is that older adults encoded the distraction at a conceptual level. They knew its meaning, and they used that information to boost their performance on a subsequent task. As you saw in the first study, the fragment completion, they know both perceptual level information and they also know general knowledge information. In both studies, as it happens, older adults outperformed younger adults. I think we should pause here and acknowledge that in general, we do not believe that older adults can outperform young adults. In these interesting experiments, they do outperform younger adults by a considerable amount. So the second thing to note about these studies is that there were actually several switches that occurred. First of all, there was the one-back task on pictures, followed by a filler task, and in some of these studies, there are 3 little mini filler tasks. And then there's yet another switch when you do the either fragment completion or the general knowledge test. Despite these switches, the influence of the past persisted for older adults. So we could ask the question of whether it's the case that older adults are attending to the wrong information. They're attending to the distraction. The other possibility is that they attend to too much information, both the distraction and the targets. So in this study, led by Jennifer Weeks, we again used the one-back task, and this was followed by a delay interval, followed by fragment completion, and we also had a picture naming task. The picture naming task asked people to name the pictures, some of which had occurred in the one-back task as targets, and some of which were new. So the first part of this is a replication of the earlier studies. Young adults here now are showing a reliable priming, although not much compared to the priming of distraction on this fragment completion task, compared to the amount of priming that older adults show. The speed-up effect, on the other hand, is pretty much the same for both older and younger adults in the picture naming task. So we have a replication, and we also have this interesting finding, which suggests that the total knowledge that older adults acquired in this task was actually greater than that of young adults. Again, another shout out to my peeps. They know the distracting information, and they know the target information. We. Okay, so now another thing that happens in these experiments with one back was shown by Karen Campbell, and that is that older adults hyperbind. That is, they not only know the targets, as the weak study showed, and the distractor, as all these other studies showed, but they bind the target and distractor together. She called this hyperbinding. Young adults don't show this phenomenon in a series of experiments that Karen led. To stretch the use of the term hyper, we might say that older adults hyperencode. They're encoding way more information than young adults are. Okay, so the good news is older adults outperform young adults. They encode distracting information and tacitly use it later on, even though it's not relevant initially. They also know about the targets, and they have access to a greater total amount of information. Too much information is active in older adults' heads, loosely speaking. So you could ask, what the heck is going on in this delay period between when people are exposed to the distraction and when we test for the distraction? Is the previous information actually active and accessible during the delay, or is it retrieved by a cue at the time of the test? So to address this question, we turn to the brain. And this is a study that was led by Jen Weeks and done in collaboration with my colleague Brad Buxbaum. So let me just describe the study to you first, and then I'll tell you about the neurodata. In the study phase, people see 4 pictures, 2 from each of 2 categories. What you're seeing are 2 faces and 2 scenes. People get 4 seconds to study these items for a recognition test that comes up after a 10-second delay. Right as this delay gets started, people get a cue telling them which of the 2 categories they're going to be tested on, and they are always tested on whichever category we tell them. So this is an example of a cue telling them to remember the faces and implicitly telling them that the scenes are really useless. Then they get 2.5 seconds to do a forced choice recognition task. So we were able in this study to use a multivoxel pattern analysis method. Multivoxel pattern analysis is an analytic technique that identifies spatial patterns of activity that differentiate between, in this instance, the 4 categories of pictures that we used. Across the study, we had faces and scenes and objects and bodies in every possible combination. So we could use this technique to look at the pattern of activation over the delay interval for the no longer relevant category of items, which is the focus of this question. These items are never tested, as I said, so there's no real need to hang on to them. So the next slide will show you the data of the non-relevant items. These are data from the medial temporal lobe, areas widely indicated as important in tasks of the sort that we used. And this shows activation in the delay period in 4 areas in the medial frontal lobe, from the left entorhinal cortex to the hippocampus to the parahippocampal cortex to the perirhinal cortex. We found age differences during the retention period. The retention period is shifted by 6 seconds to accommodate the hemodynamic lag, with older adults showing more uncued pattern activity in the medial temporal lobe than young adults do. So you can see this yourself by looking at the blue ribbon versus at the orange ribbon. In this delay period, older adults have more activity for the non-relevant items. So we took this to mean that there is evidence of sustained activation of irrelevant items during the working memory delay period for older adults compared to younger adults. And the question is, now, does this correlate with behavior? Does this sustained activation of irrelevant information make a difference? And the answer to this is yes. And the way you can read this graph is by looking at the bottom at recognition accuracy for cued items from bad accuracy to better accuracy, and then looking on the y-axis for a measure of the activity in the uncued area. So both older and younger adults are showing that as there is more activity for the uncued category, recognition performance declines. There is sustained activation of the past, and the question is now, can we use this funny phenomenon that older adults show and young adults appear not to show to influence explicit memory? This was the beginning of an applied memory project that was spearheaded by Renee Biss, because we wanted to see if we could improve the memory performance of older adults on explicit memory tasks. We're now going to use distraction as a rehearsal device. And here's how this study went. In the first phase of the experiment, you study for a free recall memory task. So this is a classic old procedure in which you see one word at a time, and then you recall the lists and the words in any order you like. In this study, there was then a retention interval. The retention interval had a couple of little mini tasks, and one of these mini tasks included the one-back task. The one-back task actually provided implicit practice for older adults who are hanging on to some of these words and who encode the distractions. So they're supposedly paying attention to the pictures, but they're also potentially picking up information about the distractor. There was at the end of this a surprise free recall task. So you do a free recall task first, and then you do the critical one-back task, and then there's a surprise test at the end. And here's what the data look like. First for younger adults. In the red bars, this is, so this is forgetting. So up is bad, more forgetting. What we're looking for is less forgetting for the repeated items, which would suggest that they were strengthening memory. There's no evidence of that among young adults, although the data waffle around quite a lot. Here's what older adults look like. If you refer to experiments 2 and 3, what you see is that older adults are showing absolutely no forgetting for these items repeated as distraction. And in experiment 1, they show minimal forgetting of these items. Actually, when you combine the two kinds of items, the repeated and unrepeated items, younger and older adults show the same total recall. So people have objected to this study because no one knew that there was going to be a final memory test. And maybe young adults would cotton to, sure there's another expression, young adults would notice the distraction in the one-back task if they knew that there was a memory test coming up. So we repeated that experiment, the original experiment, now led by Joan Go, and we tested younger adults and older adults, looking at the impact of repeated items and non-repeated items as an opportunity for rehearsal. What you see is a basic replication of the earlier study in which people were uninformed. For younger adults, the presentation of these repeated items makes absolutely no difference. For older adults, it makes a dramatic difference. This is a way that we can seize on this unusual quality that older adults show to help them remember information. So, repeating items as distraction minimized and even eliminated older adults' forgetting. Given sustained activation, distraction appears to be able to serve as an implicit rehearsal opportunity, but only for older adults. Younger adults generally showed no benefit, even when they knew there'd be a final test. So, too much information from the past leaks into the present. Older adults have more information in mind from the recent past, whether it was previously relevant, as in the free recall study, or not, as in the distracting words in the one-back task. Switch points matter much less for older adults than they do for young adults. And Older adults also sustain activation of the recent past. Again, older adults have more information in mind than young adults do. There are age differences in the impact of current distraction. There are age differences in the impact of no longer relevant information. And given all this information in mind, how do older adults or anyone in this situation actually select one response from potentially many to produce in any given moment? There is actually a substantial literature, which some of you will be familiar with, showing how a large consideration set, many, many items when you only want to recall one of them, disrupts retrieval. So we know that too much information is not good for explicit remembering of a single piece of information. In a series of studies, we hope to find out what happens to the rejected information, where you produce one John's last name, but you have all these other friends named John. What happens to their last names? What's the consequence of selecting a target item in the face of competition? The idea was that effective selection actually involves suppression of unselected items. To use Carl Healy's terminology for these studies, we were looking to find a fingerprint of inhibition in memory. So in the first phase of this experiment, people see a series of unrelated words. Included in this series of unrelated words are pairs of words that are phonologically similar to each other. For example, allergy and analogy. What you do, and they appear separated from each other in the list. So you see a word and your task is just to indicate how many vowels that word has. And then you see another word and you say how many vowels, and another word and so on. You see allergy, you see analogy, and then in the next phase of the experiment, you get a fragment completion task. The fragment completion task for the critical items can only be completed by one of the two members of the pair. In this example, it can only be completed by allergy. On the other hand, these items were selected so that both items might be triggered by the fragment. And then we wanted to see what happened to the rejected item, analogy. There were several control conditions, but I'm just going to highlight the comparison between people who saw allergy and analogy, solved allergy, with people who never saw these items in the beginning of the experiment, and all they did was to name these words at the very end. So now let me show you what the task looked like. You study, you study words, you decide how many vowels they have in them, and then you get a fragment completion task, and then we test for naming time of the incorrect item for the fragment. Okay, so what might we expect here? The control group is only in the naming time task. They didn't see any of these words in the context of the experiment, so naming time up means you're taking longer to name it. So this is what the baseline people might do. If analogy were suppressed when allergy was selected, then you might be slower to name analogy than the baseline people. If, on the other hand, the item wasn't suppressed at the time of selection, you might actually be faster. This could happen because you solve allergy, but you think analogy and you rehearse analogy. Now let's look at the data. These are the data for young adults. The red-ish shows you the baseline, and the bluish shows you the interference condition. What you see is that young adults are no faster to name analogy than people who have seen analogy in the context of the experiment. They're no faster to name it than the people who haven't seen it at all in the context of the experiment. And what we think this means, at least in the context of this experiment, is that analogy was dampened down to its semantic memory baseline. So there was actually inhibition operating here, just didn't produce below baseline access. Here are the data for older adults. Their baseline, they're a little slower to name these words, and they are faster to name analogy and its companions, because when they selected allergy, they also rehearsed the competitor. So this is yet another example of too much information hanging on in the minds of older adults relative to young adults. Another study in this series was done by Avanti Day and Mitch Summers, who replicated these findings using identifying words like analogy in a noisy environment as the dependent measure. Young adults apparently suppress competitors. We do have other studies led by Joan Nago showing that there was indeed below baseline access to these items. Older adults strengthen the competitors and end up with too much information in mind. So now we get to the summary of this talk. These are the 3 points in time at which distraction needs to be suppressed, irrelevant information that coincides with a target task, no longer relevant information, and irrelevant information on competition for response. So just to return to the theory at the beginning of the talk, we proposed in different language that inhibition works to filter out irrelevant or unwanted information. We called this control over access. We also showed that people disengage in the second part of the task from no longer relevant or never relevant information. They do that if they're young and not so much if they're older. And we called this deletion, the deletion function of inhibition. People also suppress competitors, enabling a response to be selected in the face of competition, and we called this restraint. So now just to show you very quickly, to remind you what we showed you, the access function inhibition narrows the focus of attention to currently relevant information. Older adults do not ignore distraction that coincides with the target task, and they are bothered by irrelevant words. In the neuroimaging study, we showed that older adults don't engage the frontoparietal network in order to deal with distraction in this one-back task. In the deletion studies, we showed that people are carrying over distraction and using it to solve implicit memory tasks. And we showed in a neuroimaging study that these irrelevant items show sustained activation in a delay period. And we also showed that we could use this sustained activation to reduce forgetting for older adults. And in the last experiment I told you about, we showed that older adults really do not restrain strong responses. Instead, they appear to rehearse them. So when inhibition is inefficient, you may have a very cluttered or crowded mind. It appears that this may be the case for older adults, for better or for worse. It's also, in this other line of work that I alluded to, the case for everyone who's operating at an off-peak time of day. This work started a very long time ago and has taken a long time to come to fruition. So there are many, many people to whom I owe gratitude. And I list them here, and I hope I've got everybody here. The people in red are the people whose studies I included in this talk. My own inhibitory mechanisms did not go very well. I had a very hard time picking the studies that I would talk about. But in any event, I am grateful to these people who generated new ideas, came up with wonderful new ways of testing these hypotheses, and actually advanced new hypotheses as well. The research was supported by the National Institute on Aging in the US and in Canada, by the Canadian Institute of Health Research, and by the National Science and Engineering Research Council. So I'm done. Thank you very much. I hope that you will enjoy psychonomics as I plan to, and I very much look forward to seeing you again sometime. Thank you.